The well-known physicist and entomologist Hank Pym is introduced in the opening scene in 1989. He works for the world's best research facility, SHIELD. He has recently discovered magical particles that can either make someone smaller or bigger. Hank has even made a suit out of these particles, which he thinks will help the country fight terrorists. The superiors at SHIELD, on the other hand, want the technology for their own use. Hank strongly opposes the creation of superhumans, despite their intentions. As a result, Hank quits SHIELD to prevent the technology from being misused. He establishes his own organization a few years later. He runs Pym Technologies with his daughter, Hope, as well as Darren the Man. Hank continues his investigation, but he conceals the suit and its technology from even his employees. Unfortunately, Darren learns about it one day and begins plotting to drive Hank out of his own business. He finally prevails, the result of much preparation. Darren is appointed as the new CEO of Pym Technologies after Hank is forced to resign. Darren calls the elderly man into his office in the present day and shows him a new suit he just designed. He refers to it as a yellow jacket. It would appear that this suit shares all of the characteristics with the one Hank had designed in 1989. Now that he has tested it on some real people, Darren plans to start mass-producing it if it works. The old man is frightened by this because he fears that the suit could devastate the city if the bad guys get their hands on it. However, Darren has no interest at all. He only needs money to live. In another location, a prisoner by the name of Scott Lang is about to be freed after spending 3 years behind bars. After infamously breaking into his own employer, he ended up in jail. Scott is grabbed by his previous accomplice, Luis, and while they're on their way, he tells Luis that he has a new heist plan for him. Scott, on the other hand, says he doesn't want to be a part of it because he doesn't want to lose his daughter. Scott applies for a number of jobs the following day, but all of them turn him down due to his criminal record. He spirals downward into depression as a result. Scott's only source of light is his daughter. He decides to visit Cassie. Sadly, his former wife, Maggie, and her new husband, a policeman, Paxton, immediately request his departure. Scott is warned by Maggie that he will need to get a decent job and pay child support if he wants to see their daughter. Scott storms out of the house, dejected, and later figures out how much money is needed for child support. He reluctantly decides to join Luis and take part in the heist after learning how much it is. In the following scene, Luis informs Scott of his mission, which calls for him to rob the home of an elderly scientist. It appears that there are a lot of expensive and valuable items there that would fetch millions of dollars on the black market. Hank Pym is the name of that scientist. Scott, who is an expert at such robberies, accepts right away. He climbs the fence that night, removes the window sensors, and then opens a window to get to the basement. He finds a fingerprint-coated second door after unlocking the basement door. Scott is fortunate to be prepared for such circumstances. Eventually, he opens the door by lifting the fingerprints with some of his tricks. Scott assumes that something very valuable is kept inside because of the extreme security. However, all he finds is an odd red suit, to his dismay. He has been under Hank Pym's constant surveillance, but he is unaware that he has entered his home. Darren is attempting to reduce a sheep to a microscopic size back at Pym Technology. He unfortunately kills the poor animal in the process. Darren is determined to continue the tests, despite the fact that the experiment was deemed unsuccessful. In another location, Scott brings the suit home and puts it on in the bathroom. After that, he uses his hand to press a red button, and as soon as he does, he suddenly shrinks to the size of an insect. Luis enters the bathroom and turns on the tap, unleashing a tsunami on the little guy, making matters even worse. Scott tries desperately to press the button with his other hand in the hope that it will bring him back to his original state, but nothing happens. As a result, he just runs for it and falls through a crack. Scott lands on the lower floor, where a party with hundreds of guests is taking place. He manages to avoid being trampled, but once more he slips through a crack and enters a different room. He is sucked into a vacuum, chased by a rat, and released by a mousetrap there. Finally, he falls through the window and onto the roof of a car. He finally shrinks back to his original size as a result of the impact. Later that evening, perplexed and terrified by the incident, Scott decides to return the suit inside the compound. However, as soon as he enters, he is surrounded by police officers. Scott is detained and taken to jail, where Paxton informs him that he has disappointed his daughter once more. Scott is informed shortly thereafter by another officer that his lawyer has arrived. The latter is surprised by this because he never sought legal counsel. He finds the scientist when he goes to find out who it is. Hank is awaiting him. The elderly man admits that ever since Scott was released from jail, he has been keeping an eye on him. In order to entice Louise, he purposefully disseminated the rumor that his house held valuables. In point of fact, he desired that Scott steal the suit and try it on. Hank then offers Scott two choices. He has the option of embracing the suit and working for him or wasting his time in prison. An army of ants suddenly appear with the suit as Scott returns to his cell confused. He doesn't give it a second thought and puts it on, and the next moment, just like before, he shrinks. After that, Scott breaks out of the prison, and a flying ant is waiting for him outside. He jumps on it right away and tries to ride it through the city, but the high speed makes him feel sick and he passes out. Scott wakes up the following morning at Hank's house with Hope and a swarm of ants watching over him. He is later summoned to the dining room by the elderly man, who tells him that he was chosen for his unique ability to sneak into places undetected. Hank then explains to Scott everything about the suit's history, including how he intends to stop Darren with it. But in exchange for that, he wants Scott to steal the yellow jacket from PIM Technology. Scott will have to delete all records of the research while he is there to prevent Darren from ever reproducing the technology again. Darren finally manages to shrink a sheep to the size of an insect at PIM Technologies. Hope notices this and becomes concerned, so she tells her dad right away. In the meantime, Scott advises the elderly man to seek assistance from the Avengers because he considers the mission to be too risky. However, the latter declines, claiming that he does not wish Tony Stark to acquire the technology. Scott is finally persuaded when he mentions that he is doing this for the sake of humanity. As a result, he begins preparing for the mission by learning to control ants and practicing martial arts. Additionally, he improves his timing by repeatedly shrinking and growing back. He once tries to shrink even more by changing his suit, but Hank stops him. The elderly man asserts that if he continues to shrink, he will reach subatomic size and enter the quantum realm, where time and space concepts are irrelevant. He cannot leave this realm once he has entered it. Hank is aware of all of this because his wife, Janet, made the same error as well. She contracted more than she should have during a mission, trapping herself in the quantum realm to this day. Scott is given the task of locating a piece of equipment for the first mission that he will need for the mission. The only drawback is that this gear is protected within the Avengers headquarters. Scott nonetheless makes his way to the location where he meets the Falcon. Wilson Sam he initially politely requests the equipment, but when the Falcon declines, they argue. After a few minutes, Scott shrinks down, enters the Falcon's suit, and destroys it from the inside. He then grabs the equipment and makes a hasty getaway for it. Darren arrives later, just as Hank and Scott are discussing their next move. He informs the elderly man that he will be selling his suit to a buyer after successfully testing it. The transaction will take place in a high-security building with microscopic mesh covering every vent. Darren, who is arrogant, invites Hank to watch the sale before he leaves. After hearing all of this, Scott realizes that the mission will be more difficult than anticipated and calls Louise for assistance. The group makes the necessary preparations and gets ready to steal the yellow jacket in the following scene. Louise lowers the water pressure inside the water pipes while posing as a security guard. Scott and his ant companions are successful in taking advantage of this opportunity to enter the building. On the other hand, when the buyer shows up, It turns out that he is an executive from the notorious underworld corporation Hydra. Humanity will face serious danger if they acquire the Yellow Jacket. Scott, on the other hand, goes into the server room to put a bomb in the system. At first, he instructs his ant companions to destroy all backup data and harm the building's security system. Scott then moves on to the transaction room to get ready to steal the Yellow Jacket. But when he tries to lunge at it, Darren arrives just in time and puts him in a glass cage. It turns out that he had been following Scott for some time and was well aware of their strategy. After that, Darren pulls out a gun and prepares to kill Hank, but Scott breaks free right at that moment and unleashes a brutal punishment on the Hydra agents. Darren shoots Hank in the chest during this time and then aims for Scott, but the tenacious ants appear and prevent him from firing. Darren somehow makes his way back with the Yellow Jacket in the bag because he knows he will lose. Scott also incapacitates all of the Hydra agents after a while and pursues him. In the meantime, the server room placed bomb is about to explode. As a result, Hope receives Hank's tank keychain and Hank requests that she make it larger. The father and daughter run out of the building before it collapses as soon as she does so. In another location, Darren flees the scene in a helicopter, but he soon notices an army of ants approaching. Scott, it turns out, was also able to get on the helicopter. Darren pulls out his gun in panic and fires at Scott, but his shots miss Scott because of his small size. Darren consequently dons the Yellow Jacket and shrinks to Scott's size because he has no other options. As a result, the two tiny humans begin their struggle for supremacy. They quickly fall from the helicopter and land in a pool, but the fighting continues. Darren is electrocuted when Scott somehow manages to throw him into a light bulb. However, Paxton arrives at the scene and detains the bad guy just as he is about to kill him. Darren wakes up after they have left and decides to take revenge on Scott by going after his family. Scott learns that someone has broken into his house while Paxton is taking him to the police station. The two quickly make their way there and find that Darren is holding little Cassie hostage. Scott is enraged by this, so he shrinks once more and starts fighting the bad guy. Darren, on the other hand, continues to repel his attacks despite his best efforts. At this point, Scott comes to the realization that in order to defeat the Yellow Jacket, he will need to further shrink into it. He knows there is no going back, but he goes ahead with it for the sake of his daughter's safety. The plan works, and as soon as Scott enters the suit, he blows it up from the inside out, making Darren disappear into thin air. However, Scott is also entangled in the quantum realm as a result of this. He is surrounded by nothing but an interminable vacuum. He makes an unsuccessful attempt to use the button on his hand. He is motivated to leave the location when he hears his daughter's cries right then. He uses the equipment he stole from the Avengers base to rewire his suit after recalling it. He is able to return to normal life after this miraculously works. Scott immediately wraps his daughter in his arms, and the police also arrive at the same time. Paxton, however, recognizes his bravery and covers for him, allowing him ample time to shrink and escape. Hank and Scott are talking about the things that happened last night in the final scene. The old man still doesn't understand how Scott got out of the quantum realm. However, he now has hope that his wife can return as well. The movie comes to a close when Luis meets up with Scott and tells him that the Avengers want to hire him. Thanks for watching my videos. Please hit that like button and do not forget to subscribe to my channel.